So our survey report today is going to provide information about the attitudes and preferences regarding items on the November ballot, as well as state and national issues. However, before discussing the findings of today's survey, I want to talk a little bit more generally about the statewide survey. The mission of the survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. We also seek to inform and improve policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. In providing a voice for all Californians, since 1998, we've interviewed over 270,000 Californians. This is the 54th survey in the Californians in Their Governments series, which, as Dave said, is generously funded through the James Irvine Foundation. And in this survey, we examine preferences for a presidential vote choice, as well as attitudes towards Proposition 30 and 38 and 31 and 32. We also surveyed attitudes towards elected officials, preferences for raising revenues, and perceptions of government trust, or in this case, distrust. 2006 Californians were interviewed, and from October 14th till the 21st on landline and cell phones, and the average time of the survey was about 19 minutes. The margin of error for all adults is about 3.2%, while the margin of error for likely voters is 4%. So the Democratic ticket of Barack Obama and Joe Biden continue to lead over Republican ticket of Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan by double digits. The president has support of 9 in 10 Democratic likely voters, while similar proportions of Republicans support the Republican ticket. Today we find that independents are divided, although in our earlier surveys in July and September, Obama was leading by double digits among independents. So this is a shift that has occurred this month. The Democratic ticket has strong support among Latinos and younger voters, while half of whites favor Romney, and older voters are more divided. As you might expect, voters in Los Angeles and in the San Francisco Bay Area support President Obama, while those in the other Southern California region, which includes Orange and San Diego counties, prefer Mitt Romney, and resident and likely voters in the Central Valley are currently divided. So today we find that most likely voters are satisfied with the choices that they have in the election for U.S. president, but satisfaction has grown steadily since we first asked about it in December 2011. Satisfaction across parties has grown about 20 points since last December. However, the largest gains among Republicans has actually happened since May, where satisfaction increased from 46% in May to 69% today. And while satisfaction has grown among independents, today we find that just over half of independents are actually satisfied with their choices when it comes to the presidential election. We find that 3 in 4 Obama supporters and 7 in 10 Romney supporters are satisfied with their choices. So even those that are voting for each candidate, there's still a proportion of people there that aren't quite satisfied. So while likely voters are generally satisfied with the choices they have, how enthusiastic are they about voting in this presidential election compared to their usual enthusiasm? Well, today we find 6 in 10 likely voters say they're more enthusiastic than usual, while 1 in 4 are less enthusiastic. Across parties, Republicans are somewhat more enthusiastic than Democrats, while independents are divided between more and less enthusiastic. Mirroring party findings, Romney supporters are somewhat more likely than Obama supporters to be more enthusiastic than usual. And while overall enthusiasm is similar to what we found in September 2008, we actually found that in 2008 Obama supporters were 17 points more likely than McCain supporters to say they're more enthusiastic. So this is something that we've all been hearing probably about at the national level, that there is somewhat of an enthusiasm gap between supporters of Romney and supporters of President Obama. And when it comes to who likely voters in California prefer to control Congress, we find that, as they have in the past, Californians continue to prefer Democratic control of Congress rather than Republican control. Independents are divided on this issue. And in the month before the 2010 midterm elections, where of course there was this somewhat of a sea change towards the Republican Party, likely voters in California were actually more divided on this issue of who they would prefer to control Congress. So with less than 2 weeks to go before Election Day, support for 2 tax measures to fund education falls short of a majority when read the ballot title and label. I will just make a note that when we ask people about any of their propositions in our survey, we read them the ballot title and label that they will see in the voter information guide and what they see when they actually vote on the measure. There's no synopsis. We just read them what they're going to hear, and sometimes it may be a little long-winded or awkward, but that's what they're going to see, so we find that's the best way to actually gauge their support. And we find today that just under half of likely voters support Proposition 30, and that since September we've actually seen the margin narrow. And today we find that the margin between yes and no voters. We find today that 39% of likely voters would vote yes on Proposition 38, while voters were much more divided at 45% yes and 45% no in our September survey. So when read the ballot title and label of Proposition 30, strong majorities of Democrats are in favor and strong majorities of Republicans would vote no. Half of independents are divided today, while just over half voiced support in September. So there's been a little bit of shift among those independent likely voters. Today, Prop 30 draws majority support among younger voters, Latinos, those who approve of Governor Brown, and those who support President Obama. More affluent voters, public school parents, and both men and women are more divided on Proposition 30. And when asked about the importance of the outcome on Proposition 30, 6 in 10 likely voters, including more than half across parties, say the outcome is very important. It is interesting that yes voters are 10 points more likely than no voters to view the outcome as very important, and that could point to somewhat of an enthusiasm gap, which in a close election could be a determining factor there. So looking at Proposition 38, we find that just over half of likely voters say they would vote no on Proposition 38, while just 4 in 10 say they would vote yes. Republicans and independents oppose Proposition 30, but only half of Democrats support Proposition 38. This is in comparison to the 7 in 10 Democrats who were supportive of Proposition 30. So there's a little bit of a drop-off in Democratic support between Proposition 30 and Proposition 38. When asked about the importance of, step back. Support for Prop 38 can be found among Latinos, who are twice as likely as whites to say they would vote yes, and among younger Californians. 6 in 10 men are opposed, while women are slightly more likely to oppose than support Proposition 38. Half of likely voters view the outcome of Proposition 8 as very important, and with Republicans more likely than Democrats and independents to say the outcome is very important. Proposition 31, which would establish a 2-year budget as well as make other budget changes to the budget process, has the support of 24% of likely voters, while just under half are opposed, and nearly 3 in 10 are undecided on how they're going to vote on this measure. Proposition 31 fails to garner majority support in any party or ideological group or in any demographic group. In fact, about 1 in 5 or more across these groups are undecided on how they would vote on Proposition 31. When asked about the importance of the outcome, only 24% say that the outcome is very important, and that includes 3 in 10 or less across parties and among yes and no voters. So, we have very few people viewing this as a very important outcome when it comes to the outcome of Proposition 31. Proposition 32, which would prohibit payroll-deducted funds for political purposes, is opposed by 53% of likely voters. Nearly 7 in 10 Democrats would vote no, while nearly 6 in 10 Republicans would vote yes, and independents are divided. Findings were similar in our September survey. There haven't been really much change there. And Proposition 32 finds support only among Republicans and those who consider themselves conservative, while there is majority opposition among Latinos, both men and women, voters across all age groups, and those with at least some college education. Half of voters consider the outcome of Proposition 38 is very important, and just over half in yes and no voters say the outcome is very important. However, this marks an 11-point increase among no voters since September. So there seems to be some growing enthusiasm or view that the outcome is important among no voters compared to yes voters. So turning away from the election and looking at state and national issues, Governor Brown has the approval of 4 in 10 Californians, with 6 in 10 Democrats approving and 7 in 10 Republicans disapproving. Independents are divided on how to rate Governor Brown, with 1 in 4 unsure of how to rate him. Approval of governor has remained, steady throughout since he took office in January 2011. However, we've seen an increase in his disapproval from 19% in January 2011 to 37% today. So while we've seen, just over 4 in 10 or about there have approved of him, we've seen this disapproval grow, while there's still a significant portion that are just unsure of how to rate him. Fewer than 3 in 10 Californians approve of the California legislature, and approval has not eclipsed 30% since January 2008. Today, fewer than 1 in 3 across parties and regions approve of the legislature. So approval of the legislature is pretty low across the board. President Obama's approval ratings continue to grow, and today 63% of likely voters approve of his job performance. Since his record low approval of 51% in September 2011, his approval has steadily climbed. As you might expect, overwhelming majorities of Democrats approve, and the same proportion of Republicans disapprove. 6 in 10 independents approve of the president, as do majorities across regions and all demographic groups, with the exception of whites, who have a 45% approval. Far fewer Californians approve of the job that the U.S. Congress is currently doing, and 3 in 4 across parties disapprove, as do at least half across regions and demographic groups. So in a rare sign of bipartisanship, Republicans, Democrats, Independents come together to say they disapprove of Congress. When we look at the mood of the state, we find that just over half of Californians say that the state is heading in the wrong directions and say they expect bad economic times in the next 12 months. However, the percentage saying that the state is heading in the wrong direction has decreased 7 points since last month and 22 points since 2008. Similarly, the percentage expressing bad times has decreased 21 points since 2008. So overall, Californians are feeling much better about the prospects of the state today. And when looking at how Californians view the direction and economic outlook of the nation, we see that Californians are far less pessimistic today compared to August 2008. Today, fewer than half view the country as headed in the wrong direction or expect bad times financially. And this is a marked improvement from 3 months before the last presidential election, when strong majorities held these views. So turning to a popular topic of the state budget, today, with 7 in 10 Californians saying the state budget situation is a big problem, it's not too surprising that 6 in 10 Californians say that their local government services have been affected a lot by recent state budget cuts. Across parties, nearly 2 in 3 Democrats and half of independents say that their services have been affected a lot. Slightly fewer Republicans hold this view. Majorities across regions say that their services have been affected a lot, as do majorities across age, income, and education groups. We find that Latinos are far more likely than whites and Asians to say that their local services have been affected a lot. So as you likely know, the budget enacted in July relies on voters passing Proposition 30, and if Proposition 30 fails, automatic spending cuts, which primarily go to K-12 education, will be enacted. If Proposition 30 fails, how do Californians prefer to resolve the state budget deficit? Well, similar percentages of Californians and likely voters would prefer either a mix of spending cuts and tax increases or to deal with the deficit mostly through spending cuts. There are striking partisan differences, though, with 6 in 10 Republicans preferring mostly spending cuts and half of Democrats preferring a mix of cuts and taxes. Independents are more divided, although they prefer a mix over mostly cuts by 9 points. So with multiple tax measures on the ballot, how do Californians feel more generally about raising taxes? We find that there's majority support among all adults and likely voters for raising taxes on the wealthy and raising taxes paid by corporations. Fewer than 1 in 3 adults or likely voters favor raising the personal income tax or the state sales tax. This is a pretty consistent finding that we've seen where people are willing to raise taxes on someone else, whether it be wealthy or corporations or in general on cigarettes or sin taxes, but when it comes to things that are directly going to impact them like the state income tax or sales tax, they're a little more reluctant. So this does have some interplay when we look at Propositions 30 and 38. Proposition 30, of course, would increase taxes on the wealthy and increase the state sales tax for 4 years, while Proposition 38 on a sliding scale would increase income taxes. So there is some connection between how people view the generalities of tax increases and these specific proposals. About half or more Democrats and independents and voters across income groups favor taxing the rich and corporations, while 1 in 3 or fewer Republicans favor any of these tax proposals. So we find that about 6 in 10 Californians and likely voters think that both the state government and the federal government waste a lot of taxpayer money. 3 in 4 Republicans say this about both levels of government, while about half of independents and Democrats say this about each level. The perception that the federal government wastes a lot of money was much higher in October 2008 when 74% held this view. And since 2008, the perception among Democrats and independents has dropped from just over 70% to about half today, while findings among Republicans are somewhat similar. At the state level, nearly 6 in 10 likely voters who think that the state government wastes a lot of taxpayer money say that they're voting no on Proposition 30. And with so many people thinking that both levels of government waste a lot of taxpayer money, how do they feel about the influence of special interest? Well, about 2 in 3 Californians, including solid majorities across parties, say that both the state and the federal government are pretty much run by a few big interests, looking out for themselves. In 2008, somewhat higher percentage thought the federal government was run by a few big interests. And when looking at those that say the federal government is run by a few big interests, likely voters are divided in their preferences for a president and their preference for who should control Congress. So with voters deciding on 11 statewide initiatives, which, by the way, all 11 put on the ballot by citizens, how do they feel about the initiative process more generally? We find that 7 in 10 adults say the initiative process is in need of changes, with 46% saying that major changes are needed. Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to say changes are needed, and Democrats are much more likely than either Republicans or independents to say that major changes are needed. We also find that Latinos are far more likely than Asians and whites to say that changes are needed to the system. And when it comes to specific reforms, we find that Californians continue to favor small or minor tweaks to the initiative process. Strong majorities favor having a period of time in which the initiative sponsor and the legislature could meet to see if a compromise solution could be reached before the initiative goes to the ballot. They also favor increasing public disclosure of funding sources for signature gathering and initiative campaigns. There's a strong majority support across parties for both reforms, and in both cases, more than 2 in 3 across regions and demographic groups are in favor. And in fact, more than 7 in 10 have favored each of these proposals each time we have asked these. So while Californians really like the initiative process, something we found a lot, and they think that on many surveys that the decisions they make are better than the ones that the governor and legislature make, they are willing to see some changes, and there is support across parties for some specific reforms to the system. Favorable perceptions of the Democratic Party have reached a record high of 58% today, and this marks an 11-point increase since last September. Impressions of the Republican Party have improved slightly since last year, and 35% currently view the GOP favorably. Favorable impressions of the Tea Party remain similar to last year, and about 1 in 4 view the movement favorably. As you might expect, Democrats view the Democratic Party favorably, and Republicans view the Republican Party and the Tea Party favorably. Just under half of independents view the Democratic Party favorably, compared to fewer who view the Republican or the Tea Party favorably. What we found regarding the need for a third party today is that Californians continue to be divided about whether the Republicans and Democrats do such a poor job that a third party is needed, or if the job they do is adequate. As you might expect, independents are more likely than Democrats or Republicans to say that a third party is needed. The belief that a third major party is needed is more widely held among those who view major parties unfavorably and those who disapprove of President Obama and Congress. So to kind of wrap up the survey, which is going to be our last pre-election survey, we find today that the Democratic ticket of Obama and Biden continue to have double-digit leads over Romney and Ryan, and we also find that just under half of likely voters would vote yes on Proposition 30, while support is lower for Proposition 38. An interesting tidbit about this that I didn't share earlier is that compared to our September survey, we find that there has been a 9-point decline in the percentage of likely voters who say they would vote yes on both 30 and 38. While at the same time, the percentage saying they would vote no on both has remained steady. We also find that most express distrust of both state and federal government and think that both waste a lot of taxpayer money, as well as being run by special interest. As I mentioned, there is a connection between trust and how people view Proposition 30, with nearly 6 in 10 of those who say a lot of taxpayer money is wasted voting no on Proposition 30. Most say that the initiative process needs changes, and there's continued support for specific reforms. But as I mentioned, Californians and likely voters have generally, over the years, been in favor of the initiative process. They think that their decisions are better, and in general like having the ability to make these decisions. We also find that, as I mentioned, record high 58% have a favorable impression of the Democratic Party, while Californians have more negative views towards the Republican Party and the Tea Party movement. So at this time, I'm going to ask Dave to come back up and maybe if he has any thoughts on the survey from his perspective, and then we'll be willing to take any questions that you may have today.
Great. Thank you very much, Dean. Just a couple quick comments before we get started. Obviously, this time of year, there's an election coming up, and probably in Sacramento more than anywhere else, we're watching Proposition 30. And what's interesting, there's a lot in this poll I think that's interesting. It tells us about what's happening with Prop 30. I mean, if you've been following the polls on this, it's really been over a long period of time fairly stable. You know, in all the polls between 50 and 55%, some mostly even more narrow than that. And you know, in this poll, it's ticked down a couple points I think 4 points from our last survey, which really isn't that much of a drop, and it shouldn't be surprising as the campaign starts to get going, but it did cross that 50% threshold. So obviously this is being watched very closely. I mean, I think if you look in this survey, you see some of the context in the environment where people are being asked about whether they want to support a tax increase, and those numbers about, is government controlled by big interests, polling at 67% is got to be on people's minds. The question about how much waste in government is there, with 60% of the population saying that it's a lot. There's a couple of other earlier surveys we've asked questions about what people know about the state budget, which has also got to come into play when they're asked questions like this. Some of the questions that stand out to me are, I think in January or in the spring we asked, what is the biggest spending category in state government? And nearly 50% said it was prisons. The number who said that we're spending at or above the national average on education was more than 50%. So you have this these kinds of broad popular awarenesses about what the budget is, and then these perceptions about the performance of issues like waste and trust. On the other hand, there's obviously I think it's interesting that as Dean mentioned, that the perception of waste in government has dropped from 74 to 60, and I would wonder whether that's we also see almost 60% saying that the spending cuts that we've had so far have had a big effect, and so there might be some perception that the waste has been trimmed, but still that's a very high number. And then lastly, for the context in Proposition 30, obviously the lead messenger on this is the governor, and his poll rating is at 42% among all adults. So, he's actually the support for the measure and the support for the governor are not that much different. So it's a challenge to get. That's one of the challenges. It's the strength of the messenger in terms of popular opinion. So with that, we'll open it up to questions.